Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV, and a short week this week because me and Mag are going away for a few days in the week. So just 3 shows coming your way, then a packed schedule after our break going into September and October. Anyway, we talk a lot about logistics on the channel, oil, steel, and today, wood. The Lumberjills cultivated, felled, and used sawmills to supply timber for the war effort. Historian, author, and timber core advocate Joanna Foat joins us live to discuss this maybe unsung part of the war effort. So good evening, Joanna. How are you today?
Good evening. I'm very well, thank you. Yeah, it's lovely to be here.
And I chose that word advocate carefully because in looking at your website, I mean, you're really battling. You're not just sort of sitting in the background letting this story kind of sit there. You're really trying to push this story and get it out there and boldly tell people what these women did. And I like that vigor that you're putting into it. So, you know, we'll start off straight away. We've got folks. We're going to start off with some questions from Joanna that you can then answer or put your answers, and then we'll go back to Joanna for the rest of the presentation. So, there are your slides. So, post these questions to the viewers, Joanna.
Thank you very much. So, yeah. So I like to encourage as much interactivity as possible in my talks. So these are some questions that I would love you to give me answers to. So what is the percentage of timber? What percentage of timber did the UK import at the beginning of World War II? And how much did we have stockpiled in months or years? Number 2, what was the wood used for during wartime? And number 3, who was Lady Gertrude Denman and how was she involved? Okay.
So, folks, what we're going to do is let you kind of think about those. In 10 minutes or so, we'll come back and we'll do the answers, but we will put some of your responses up on screen to see what you all think. And I'm relying on you World War II TV regulars to be pretty good at this. You're really quite good at this. So we'll see. So back to you, Joanna.
Thank you. So yeah, just a brief intro into how I sort of like discovered the Lumberjills and my journey to learning all about them. So I was working at the Forestry Commission at Alice Holt Forest in Surrey, and I was working in communications, so writing about climate change and trees of the future, kind of butterfly introductions, Nordic walking, you know, encouraging people to get out and be active in the forest and all sorts of things. And my boss said to me one day that he was really proud of his all-female management team. And I honestly thought, wow, what a lovely man he is, celebrating the women that worked for him. And he always gave me a load of kind of long rein to go and find stories that I thought were interesting. And I thought, oh, women in forestry, like, no, that's interesting. I'd recently been in contact with a journalist from BBC Radio 4 Woman's Hour. And so I thought, what about I pitch a story to her on women in forestry? But at the time, I really didn't have much of a story. There was no investment into women's initiatives to encourage women into forestry. So I drew a bit of a blank, but I carried on researching. In my research, I phoned a lady in human resources in Forestry Commission Scotland, and I said, is there anything new in women's forestry at the moment? And she said, new, Joe, there's nothing new. She literally laughed at me. She said, there's nothing new about women in forestry. They've been doing it in their thousands since World War I and World War II, and they were called Lumberjills. And I was sitting in this little office in the woods, and I honestly thought, what? Thousands of women working in the forest during wartime? And she said, yeah, cutting down trees with an axe and crosscut saw. And I had never heard of them before. Who here had never heard of them before? I wonder, you know, it'd be interesting to know. And I just thought, how can I spoke to my colleagues, like female foresters, and I said, have you heard of the Lumberjills before? No, they were trained foresters. And I looked online and there was just one website. And then I looked in history books and there was like 2 lines in some history books, and 1 chapter at most, but very kind of like slim information, not much at all. And I just thought, it reminded me of when I was in my early 20s, and one Christmas my father had bought me a present, which he was very excited about. He rushed out of the kitchen into the shed, banged around a bit, and in he came with an axe, and he said, "Happy Christmas, Joe." And I just thought that that was the craziest present I've ever been bought, but I really loved that axe, and I thought, had I been born just 50 years earlier, maybe I would have been a lumberjill, and it's not that long ago. And I just thought, my goodness, I really want to meet those women and find out what their lives were like. And yeah, so that set me off on this whole kind of 15-year journey. And so I traveled the country and I met 60 of these women. So here are some of the first 4 that I met. So top left is Edna. She was from Yorkshire and she was a spinner in the woolen mills before the war. She kept me waiting in a cafe for about 6 hours before she answered her phone, even though we had a 10 o'clock appointment, because she was so upset that day because nobody had ever taken an interest in their story that she didn't feel like she could meet me. Eventually, she answered the phone when I was about to give up. And she told me her story. So then top right, there's Audrey. So Audrey was from Sussex, West Sussex, and before the war, she desperately wanted to become a teacher, but her parents said now is not the time to invest in a career for a daughter. The default destination for women at that time was to become a housewife. And so they said they'd rather like her to stay at home and look after her younger brother, Fred. And she told me it pained her till that day that they didn't let her carry on with her education, but that was very normal in the time. So many of the other Lumberjills, they worked in domestic service as shop assistants. And in fact, Violet in the bottom left there, she was from Lostwithiel in Cornwall, and she worked in a milk bar making coffees and clotted cream and ice cream. And so that's what she did before the war. And then there was Dorothy. She was from Derbyshire and she was a hairdresser. So you can see that all of these women had very traditional female jobs, and none of them had any idea what was ahead of them when the war started. So for someone like Dorothy, she literally swapped her scissors and comb for an axe and crosscut saw. So now I have come to the questions. So I don't that you had, so it's very quick. I don't know if you've got any.
No, we've got loads of responses. So okay. I'll just put them all up and then I'll let you kind of ponder them. So Andreas is saying for number 1, 95% and 2 months. Veronica is saying 60% import. So I'm doing the one about number 1 first. Some people say, Ian says 50% for number 1. What the other ones for number 1? Most people do. Oh, Ian Carr is saying 80%, and then we'll get onto aircraft and landing craft later on. So a high number is being put for the import. So let's do the import, then we'll go to question 2 in a minute. I think we'll do it that way. So
So very good to whoever was in the 90s, because the answer is 96%. Wow. We were the largest timber importing nation in the world back then. We only produced 4% of homegrown timber, and that was with about 14,000 people, but in all different things like furniture making and all various things. And why was that? You might have some answers there, but I'm not giving you much time. The reason was because in World War I, we had felled almost half our forests and trees for the war effort. And that was why the Forestry Commission was set up in 1919 to replant Britain's forests in case there was another war. But obviously 20 years later it's not that long to grow a stock of trees. So how much do you think we had stockpiled in months or years? We had a couple of guesses there. I think
a couple of months, didn't we? Yeah, most people didn't kind of go into the length of time. I don't think. No. If I did, I can't see it, but I'm going to guess not very much.
No, we didn't. So we had just 7 months stockpiled. And there were certain people that were really desperately worried about that. So I guess that leads on to my next question. Why would people be worried about our nation running out of wood during wartime? What was it needed for?
Yeah, well, loads of really good ones. So Norma over in Canada, good corduroy roads was her contribution, and someone else said corduroy roads as well. Gail Copper said pit props for miners, and other people said mining as well, which I wouldn't have thought of, I think.
If I can
I'll just go through them all there as they go through. So Terry, aircraft, mosquitoes, firearms. Ian T just said everything, which is a nice catch-all response there.
A shortcut,
yeah. Bomber Command Historia, most huts on RAF bases, railway sleepers, housing. Veronica, heating, cooking, fueling machines. Some vehicles could have been fueled. Andreas, rails, ships, bunkers, replacement of bombed homes, airplanes, gliders, ships, boats, landing craft, MGBs, MTBs, airplanes, railways, tent poles. So left field one there, wouldn't have thought. Containers for ammunition, barracks, aircraft, landing craft, firearms, blah blah blah. Rob, cardboard, air raid shelter, and that's. I'm glad there's actually an exclamation part after cardboard, because I read that first as cardboard air raid shelters, which I don't think were a big thing. Cardboard, comma, air raid shelters. Matchsticks, which great response. And then Rob again, mines. So
okay,
basically, you've had everything that's
I
ever
have
been
had
made
a
out
load
of
of
wood
things there.
ever covered,
So
I think. Yeah.
I basically repeat all of those, but I would just like to pick out Gail's answer of coal mines and pit props. That is my number one answer. So well done, Gail. So I was half the wood we needed during wartime went down the coal mines to, if people don't know what pit props are, they hold up the ceiling of the coal mines so that the miners can work underneath with their pickaxes. So a couple of years ago, I wrote an exhibition for Forestry England about the Lumberjills, and I did a talk there. And at the end, this man came up to me at the end and he said, my grandfather was a merchant seaman, and his job was to import timber from abroad during wartime. And he said on one of those trips back from wherever, he didn't say where it was coming from, their boat got hit. And unfortunately, the boat went down. And he said that the next boat coming along, as they were ploughing through the waters, they heard something clonking up against the hull of their boat. So they looked overboard, and there in the sea, scattered, were thousands of pit props all over the surface of the water. And clinging to one of those pit props was this man's grandfather. And he was the only man that survived that ship, on that ship going down. And it just really made me realize the kind of how everything is so interconnected with what happens abroad to what happens at home. And he said to me, the Lumberjills weren't just providing wood for the war effort, they were saving lives of merchant seamen too. So a really wonderful story. So yes, a lot of the other uses you've already mentioned. So we've got railway sleepers, telegraph poles, rifle butts,
aircraft, landing craft, but we've had some more guesses come in. People are thinking even more so. Tamsin, coffins. It's a gloomy response, but
very true.
Makes sense.
Yes. And crosses. There was also quite a lot of the Lumberjills made a lot of production of charcoal, which was used in making smoke screens for crossing the Rhine, and also for blowing up bridges, because there were certain types of charcoal that were very good at timing. So the list goes on and on. So I think that's probably enough for now, but you can see how important it is. It was the number one natural resource that we needed during wartime, even ahead of coal. So my next question, who was Lady Gertrude Denman?
Well, most people who were just being honest. Veronica, no idea. Shame on me, she said. And someone else said no idea. Oh yeah, Ian for that one was I don't know. Nikki knew. Nikki, she was director of the Women's Land Army.
Great. Yeah.
I know Nikki, so I don't think Nikki would have cheated there. So I can't tell whether people are busy Googling away. But yeah, but thanks ever so much for your response. There was some real left field ones I'd never have thought of. So brilliant.
That's brilliant. Yeah, no, thank you very much. So this is Lady Gertrude Denman. She is, I discovered in my research, not only are there thousands and thousands of lumberjills that have been forgotten from history, but also this lady who is actually really significant, really important woman who many people have never heard of. She was the very first chairwoman of the National Federation of Women's Institutes, among other things. So she was the chair of the National Federation of Women's Institutes for 30 years. She was re-elected every year. So she made a huge contribution to the roles that women would play in society and during wartime. She was also really involved in World War I, in recruiting women into the Women's Land Army. And yes, as Nikki said, in World War II, she was director of the Women's Land Army and Timber Corps, and she set it up in absolute record time with incredible business-like quality. And over the course of the war, recruited thousands, hundreds of thousands of women into the Women's Land Army and Timber Corps. So she's a really incredible, amazing woman. I do a whole talk about her, but I won't dwell on her too much more, but I always like to give her a shout out. One of the reasons that I love this woman is because this picture on the left is her in her 20s. It's quite an unusual picture for a young woman from the aristocracy to be seen dressed like this.
Yeah, trousers, whatever next, you know.
Yeah. And so in her free time, when she was out in Australia, she'd love riding out across the bush on horseback, chopping down trees and making campfires, and sleeping on a bushy bed of eucalyptus leaves under the stars. So in my mind, I think she's a bit of a lumberjill at heart. She certainly was a very adventurous woman. So that's Lady Denman. So moving on to the task of World War II and the timber crisis. The government and the timber industry realised that they were very low on numbers. Well, all the young men obviously had gone off to fight in the war. And so they were desperately looking for people that could work in forestry. They considered schoolboys, students, and even bringing British prisoners out of prison to do the job, but they certainly didn't want to consider the young women for this job. But then they realised that the situation was so desperate and there was perhaps some lighter forestry duties that the women could do. So one of those jobs required, first of all, they stated that they wanted women from university who had studied maths or science to make themselves available to do this job, where they had to operate this device in the middle of the picture, which is a tape measure. So in my mind, they were slightly overqualified for the job. They were actually recruited as measurers. They were required to measure the girth of a tree with a tape measure and measure the length of a felled tree to calculate the cubic quantity of wood in trees that were being felled. And this was important for calculating wages for the fellers and also for prices for stocks and sales from estate owners. So this is Hazel. She was one of the measurers. And this is a picture of Heather Rumsby. She was a measurer as well. I love this picture, one of my favorites. You can see her measuring the tree there. Heather said it wasn't actually very difficult arithmetic, but there was a lot of responsibility to it. So they certainly didn't need such high qualifications. So that was the measurers, and they were the first women to be recruited in numbers during World War II into forestry work. But meanwhile, there was all the heavy felling work that needed doing. So this is a lady called Enid. I was very excited to meet her. It was when I was traveling the country to meet these women, it was 2012. And I'm sure you will all remember what 2012 was famous for. So she was very excited to tell me that she had just missed out on her chance to compete in the Olympics before the war in swimming. She was an incredible athlete. She was a top golfer. She used to compete around all the Scottish golf clubs. She was originally a Scottish from Scotland. So when she was recruited into the Scottish Women's Timber Corps, she was so good because the swing of the axe, the swing of the golf club probably translated very well to the swing of the axe. And within 1 month, she was promoted to supervisor and put in charge of training 40 women every month in felling trees with an axe and a crosscut saw. But it wasn't until 1942, when the Battle of the Atlantic started, that there was ever an official Women's Timber Corps. Basically, before that, they were known as the Women's Land Army working in forestry. So there was about 1,200 of these women, based on the success that they had had in working in forestry. There should have been more, but the resistance and prejudice against the women and the worry that they might have favoured Women's Land Army work or going into other services meant that there was only 1,200 in forestry. But on the basis of those women, a Women's Timber Corps was set up, and thereafter there was training camps set up across the country where hundreds of women were sent every month and trained in 4 lines of work. And this is a group of women from this picture from the Forest of Dean. A lovely picture. You can see how happy they look. I mean, any comments in the chat, please do. I'm going to show you some amazing photographs. If you have any comments you'd like to make, please do. But they all look very happy, and there they are on their bicycles.
Yeah.
So yeah, when the Women's Timber Corps was set up, they received the same uniform as the Women's Land Army, which I'm going to talk about in just a sec. But the difference was they were given these badges. So here's another question for you. Does anybody know the crossed axe badge on the right, where that came from? I have no doubt somebody will come up with it. And there was the Bakelite Women's Timber Corps badge as well, which was worn on the beret. So for many of these women, this would have been the first time that they wore trousers ever. And this was, that's right, pioneers, well done. And so this would have been the first time they wore trousers. You can see they're wearing the woolly jumper and the jodhpurs. And there was lots of things to be said about this outfit. When I do my talks, often in the audience, I have a lot of people that tell me stories about, the complications of wearing trousers and the prejudice and stigma against it. It was often seen as a reflection of poor morals if women wore trousers. And so, perhaps they were showing off their bottoms a bit too much. They were very curvaceous on the hips. And so it was, but it was they were basically pioneering a new fashion for women in trousers. And so it was a very important thing for them to be able to wear that uniform, to have that identity that they could work in what was.
I mean, it's ridiculous, even in 2025, to think that the discussions about the clothing being a bit too, sexy, not about the safety of working with lumber and the more actual pertinent questions. It's sort of these superficial things about, but they're wearing trousers. I mean, it sounds ridiculous now. I mean, but yeah, we are getting questions about safety, coming in about I'll give you one as a representation of what's coming in. So Veronica asked, these units, were they exclusively female, and what about safety? That came in really early, because I mean, I've done a little bit of work in forests. I mean, trees falling down, sawmills, tractors, ropes, wires, hawsers, lots of things can go wrong.
It was so dangerous. It was so dangerous. And not all of them got training. So they would have had training when they went on a training camp. But many of them didn't. And I've recently written an article for Heritage Tractor magazine. And my goodness, delving into those stories, it's absolutely terrifying. Like you said, setting up the haulage with pulleys and wires and things, and just the felling itself, very, very dangerous. Yes. So health and safety, I don't know how seriously it was considered, but not enough for the tractor driving, that's for sure. Because they didn't even receive training until they were 21, and that meant that a lot of the women were ruled out because they were doing their training at 17, and but they were still expected to drive tractors and lorries after that anyway. So the outfit there that Kathleen is wearing is probably, they would wear that more for Spitfire rallies and kind of smarter gear. But once they were out in the forest, they were getting dirty and grubby. You can see this picture here at the front cover of my history book. I love this picture. It just shows how they've completely customized their outfits. They've chopped them off and made them into shorts, which of course they got in a lot of trouble for doing. But you can see they've got very grubby knees, and they're not wearing the beret was the thing that distinguished the Lumberjills from the Women's Land Army, but they're not wearing them. They were wearing scarves to protect their hair from all the sticky resin. I just love this picture. It just shows that they look very happy, but I've been assured by people that work in timber, those logs are very, very heavy, and I've tried it myself and I can vouch for it. So they do make it look like light work, but it really isn't.
Yeah. And we should remind people that the links to your website and the purchase of those books are in the description below, as they always are, folks. So please go out there and learn about this other aspect of the war beyond this talk. And of course, if you're running an organization, Joanna is available for talks and conferences and other sort of work. So we're a plug done. Back to you.
Oh, so I came across this wonderful story. So this lady called Dorothy, she was working in the Lumberjills. She discovered that some of the other women's services got their underwear as part of their uniform. And she wasn't very happy about that because she didn't want to use her clothing coupons to buy boring old underwear. So she wanted to buy dresses or dancing shoes to go out in the evenings. And so her and her pals complained to the government, and they said, we'd like our uniform as part, issued with our underwear issued as part of our uniform. And they were amazed because their request was granted, and they received these brown paper packages filled with these special issue undies. And when they opened them, they called them long-legged knickerbockers with interlock chin high vest passion killers. And this is what they look like. You can see how they felt about them from this picture, I'm sure. But a lot of the ladies that I met, they told me about these. So Edna cut them off and made them shorter. They wrote sarcastic poems about them, one of which is in my book. And Joan, she thought she had a great idea. She thought, I know what, I'll wear these underneath this dress because I want to go to this lovely summer party and wear this dress, which can be slightly see-through at times. So these underwear will protect my modesty. So she went to this party, and her friends started all giggling behind her, and she thought, oh no, what are you laughing at? And they said basically, don't worry, Joan, the only thing we can see is the War Office stamp on your bottom. They did have fun, those girls. So once they were in Women's Timber Corps training camps, they were trained in 4 lines of work. So felling the trees with an axe and saw. So they were said to be very proficient with an axe. They were very good at listening to instructions, although they were teased a lot for their skills. Here they are working with a bushman saw out in the forest, or should it be called a bushwoman saw? And here we have a crosscut saw, which is obviously what they use. This picture is a posed picture because it's very difficult to take a photograph of people using a crosscut saw in action on a tree.
Yeah.
So,
and I'm just going to ask, because I've done a little bit. Yeah. You've got a forestry background. I mean, I've done a little bit of work. It's about technique, not strength. My recollection of that, it's how you balance the wood, where you set it up, what angle, keeping the saw oiled, all that kind of stuff, and just the use of an axe. A big person can use an axe badly, and a smaller, theoretically less strong person can use an axe much more efficiently. It's angles, it's using the physics to swing it and have the impact in the right place. So were these ladies given sort of basic, physics instruction about the best, or was it much more sort of on the job learning how to do it for themselves?
I mean, I think it was a real mix. Some of them definitely said, we got no training at all. We were literally handed the axe and said, off you go, you know. Well, meanwhile, there was others that did a week-long course in it at a training camp. So they would have been, you know, given. But I think, you know, things like don't drop the axe blade down and kind of, you know, keep it nice and sharp and all of that stuff, they would have been told those things, because that makes a huge difference as to how, you know, even working for a whole day with one axe or one saw is going to get blunt, isn't it?
Yeah.
Here, this is Margaret, who I met, and she told me about how her and her felling partner were working on in an oak wood in North London, and it was a very hot summer's day, probably not dissimilar to today, and there they were out in the forest. They'd been told they needed to fell the trees with a white dot on them, and so her and her felling partner, all the whole forest was in full foliage. There was understory that was really dense, so all the bracken and brambles and holly. So she said they identified this tree, this oak tree. They found the white dot, and then they had to hack away all the understory first to get to the base of the tree before they could even start working on the roots, etc. So then you identify which way you want the tree to fall. You cut the diamond shape in that side, and then you work through carefully from the other side to get to the hinge in the middle. So just as you leave this thin strip of wood in the middle, and at a certain point, gravity takes that tree and it starts to teeter on its edge. So there was a very special word they had to shout at this point. If anybody wants to shout it at home.
I feel like it's QI now, and I'm going to be the Alan Davis and say something, and you're going to go, and it's going to be wrong. I want to say timber, but I'm assuming is it a trick question?
No, that was it.
Okay.
Rest assured. So she shouted timber just as this tree started toppling off its base, and just as the tree started moving away from the other trees in the canopy and daylight started coming through, she heard this very strange pinging noise which she hadn't heard before. But then at that point she had to literally leg it in the other direction, because the tree's coming down and sometimes they can kick back, so you have to get out of the danger zone. And then that tree came crashing down. If you've ever been that close to a huge tree coming down, it is quite incredible. You can feel the ground shaking beneath your feet, even if you're 100 yards away. So once the trees stopped thrashing around and everything, their job then after that was to work their way up the tree, chop off all the branches to get that trunk ready for processing for the sawmills. Well, about an hour later, there they were working on the tree when they noticed smoke rising from the bushes around them. They were very worried it might be a forest fire or something, and so they thought they knew what to do, had to go and run over and stamp it out. When they got there, all of a sudden a group of policemen jumped up from the bushes and they said, "You're under arrest." And they said, "Why?" And they said, "You're under arrest for sabotage because you've brought the phone lines down in the canopy above." And those phone lines went straight to Churchill's war rooms, so they were in a lot of trouble. So they did get questioned, but then they were obviously always fine. But there was a lot of suspicion on these women who were working in the forest with maps at the time because of spy fever and things like that. So there was many stories about those things. So they were also working in sawmills. These are mobile saw benches out in the forest, and don't be fooled by this very idyllic picture of the sawdust flying in the air and the sort of dappled sunlight coming through the trees, because it was probably one of the most dangerous and noisy and awful jobs to do. But the women did it, and some of the men actually refused to do it. Because it was so dangerous. It's very common for people to lose fingers, and I met a lumberjill who lost a thumb in the sawmill. Otherwise, they worked in even larger sawmills in huts and things. So they also worked with horses. Many of these women from large towns and cities across the north of England. So for Lady Denman, she recognised it as another way of evacuating these women out into the countryside to bring them into a safer environment. But they really, because they were from cities, they had no idea about country life or about how to work with horses. And so they often didn't work out. They had to water them and feed them to keep them working all day long. And then when I'd been working at Alice Holt Forest for a couple of years into my research, I discovered that there was 12 Lumberjills that worked there where I was working. So that was very exciting. And these are two of the Lumberjills. So Joyce is on the left there. And they were huge oak trees they were felling there with and towing them with Fords and major tractors that they had to be careful not to kind of pull up in the begging position because the logs were too heavy on the back, and then these caterpillar crawler tractors as well. And then once they got moved into haulage, it was every woman's job to load these pit props, these logs onto the backs of lorries, because pit props were urgent throughout the war, so there was always a time pressure on it. And lifting up these pit props and carrying them out of the forest every day was basically a bit more like weightlifting. So these women got very, very strong. And you can see there, they're kind of loading up this flatbed lorry. They would have, once that would have been filled up, the common practice, unfortunately, was there was never anybody there to unload it at the other end if they were going to a railway or a mine or a dockyard. And so often the girls would jump on top and they would say, hanging on for dear life. We would drive down with the driver sitting on top to unload it at the other end. They said they knew they shouldn't have done it, but they did. And unfortunately, there were fatalities with this practice.
And can you go back to that photo for a second, Joanna? Because I'm probably guilty. Like, we all have misconceptions about things. And I definitely think, even though I know about the Women's Land Army, because our mutual friend Nikki Reynolds over the years, I still, in the back of my mind, with the land, I have a little bit of perception of sort of rather dainty baskets of carrots. I mean, I shouldn't have that perception, but part of me that's sort of lurking there. These photos are absolutely blowing out of the water any perception that the Women's Timber Corps are doing light work. Every photo you've shown has been of just proper, full-blown physical labor, massive, great logs, trucks, tractors, all that. I'm not saying the Women's Land Army didn't also do the rough stuff, because I know they did, but I definitely have that perception, if you know what I mean, of it being slightly sort of, not dainty is not the right word, but you know what I mean. I'm just blown away by just the absolute physicality of this.
Yeah, it was, I think you've said it all. It was a very physically demanding job. Yeah. And, to prove the point, here are two women from Alice Holt Forest. You can see the size of this lady's biceps and her forearms. They had incredibly well-developed shoulders as well. There was a medical kind of assessment done of the women, and they said they had incredible physique, muscular physique. So doing that work day in, day out is going to happen, isn't it? And apparently it happened quite quickly. After about a month, they were kind of job ready. Thank you. So this is a group of women. So that's Kathleen in the driving seat there. She was mortified that the photographer caught her with her tongue poking out. But her job throughout the whole of the war was to drive haulage trucks filled with timber. So this was her gang, and they would work from Lanhydrock sawmill. They would load up timber from the sawmill and take it off to the railway or the dockyards or kind of the mines. And that's what they did day in, day out, all the time. She worked throughout the war, and towards the end, she was sent on a top secret mission where she had to deliver lorry load after lorry load of wood to drive through some bombed out dockyards to deliver some wood. She would be met there. Some men would take the lorry away and they'd bring it back empty. And she later discovered that was wood being provided for the floating Mulberry harbours. And there was also many women preparing D-Day landing trackway out of coppice, chestnut coppice and wires, so that vehicles could land safely on the beach and continue on their journey. So the work they were doing was of absolute utmost importance throughout the war, all the way through to the end. And Kathleen, this is the job she did throughout the war, but apparently she didn't get her driving license until about 1950s.
Wow. Do you mind if we do a flurry of questions, because they are building up? So
Yeah.
which is great. So Gina is asking, what hours did they work, breaks, weekends? I mean, when we were talking about, for example, factories on the channel, factories have to have pretty rigid hours. A factory can only work to 24 hours a day, and it's shift work. But I'm assuming, as you said, that about the emergency secret work of getting the stuff ready for the mulberries, that with the timber core, it was very sort of depending on the urgency, depending on the season, depending on what's needed. But what's your response?
So they definitely worked. I think most of them worked 5.5 days a week, did a half day on a Saturday. I think in the summers they would have worked longer, probably kind of 8 or 9 till 5. And then the winters, because of daylight, they probably would have had to stopped earlier. But yeah, it was pretty kind of full on, I think, for them so many of them said those pit props were so urgent, they just had to keep them coming as fast as they could.
And in terms of that, sorry, just to continue that line of questioning. So Philip Blood said, Dr. Phil, hello over to you over in Aachen. Did they receive extra rations for the hard work? And then Peter said, did these women get fed well? The work looks very physical. So I mean, you said they put on weight, they were looking muscular. I mean, that physical work will do that, but you're going to be burning calories. So how did it work in terms of rations?
Very good questions. So they did actually get an extra 12. Well, they got 12 ounces of cheese, but because they were itinerant workers, they often actually didn't get their full rations because they were moving from forest to forest and billet to billet. So that was quite difficult to keep up with it. The women really complained about not having enough food. They were often living on cheese, dry bread, sandwiches, and beetroot sandwiches, because beetroots weren't on rations. So, stories about being fed beetroot sandwiches for 6 months at one billet, and jugged hare stew, because that wasn't on rations, and various things. Yeah. And they really, I think often people didn't think they would have a big appetite because they were women, but they were absolutely voraciously hungry, and so they were delighted. I had very heartfelt memories coming out of the women when they said, "Oh, and we remember when we met this couple on the train, and they invited us back to their house for a good Sunday roast," and they were like so grateful. Or anybody that gave them a really good breakfast. It was really kind of implanted in their hearts, I think. Wow. They relied a lot on scrumping and all of that kind of stuff being given kindnesses from people, apples and berries and watercress and things like that that people could find. So brilliant. Hungry all the time. So this is a photograph on Loch Foyle, and there was a huge activity with lots of lumberjills up in Scotland. And one of the ladies, on her first day at work, she was sent to work at Loch Foyle, and she was asked if she could swim, and she said, well, yes, but what were they going to ask her to do? That afternoon, she was asked if she could drive a motorboat. And she was towing 200 trees behind it, because that was the quickest way to get those trees to the nearest road and to the nearest lorry that could take them off to the coal mines, because they were so urgent. So they really did find themselves doing extraordinary things. And staying in Scotland, this is actually a photograph from Loch Foyle. And one of the ladies I met called Molly. So if you can spot the dog in this picture, congratulations. If you find the dog, then immediately above the dog is Molly in a sort of bluish looking
Bluey violet jumper. Yeah, lovely.
That's it. And so Molly, you can see there she's with a lot of men. So yes, she did work with some men. She worked with the men that were too young or too old to be conscripted. There was also conscientious objectors that were often working in the forests. And there was also German and Italian prisoners of war as well. And up in Scotland, they were very excited because there was hundreds of Canadian lumberjacks and New Zealand lumberjacks that had been brought over to help our country produce more wood. And so for many of those lumberjills, love was in the air. And many of them got married and eloped back to Canada or America or various other places after meeting GIs up there and things. So, all sorts of interesting stories about working alongside the German prisoners of war or Italian prisoners of war. Really lovely human stories, but obviously flirtations and that kind of thing as well. So,
well, it is the wartime. If you can't do a bit of flirting in the middle of a war, then when can you? When can you?
Yeah. So some of the other really important work they did was to plant trees. So I found this photograph in Kielder Castle attic in some boxes under loads of bats, guano and forest machinery, along with a kind of badge from World War I, a forestry badge from the Women's Forestry. I can't remember what they're called now, but from World War I. Anyway, found this picture. There were 12 women there that were planting trees. Kielder Forest wasn't a very big forest at all at the time, and they were planting 2,000 trees a day up there. And up and down the country every winter, it was absolutely imperative for the women to be replanting the trees that we were chopping down. So over the course of the war, we were planting millions and millions of trees. And many of those are still standing 80 years later and provide like a really good stock of trees today. So that's a really nice legacy.
You just put it on that photo just for a second, because there was a comment that came in from Veronica earlier that I think this photo, as several of them have, just typifies. And Veronica's saying, and look at them. They are all well groomed even after bone-breaking work. Being feminine and strong, I'm absolutely in love, Veronica said. She also said, the one you had with the dog is that they look like the women in Yugoslavia, the partisans. You could take that photo and move it to, Bosnia-Herzegovina in the middle of the Fifth Offensive, and it would look exactly the same. There's that sort of back to nature of living in forests. You end up looking like people who live in forests. So interesting connection there. But the glamour aspect, every time I've had a presenter on talking about, be it the 6888 or the Women's Land Army or whatever it would be, the ferry pilots, there's always this element of women needing to retain that femininity, no matter what you're doing, whatever war zone you're in. I'm assuming that that's exactly the same in the women's timber corps. They don't mind getting grubby, but they still want to have that, looking nice.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, a lot of them I spoke to, they said they didn't have the money to to buy nice clothes, and they were on quite low money. They would, one of them said that every time they heard that if lipstick was in at Boots, there would be a long queue of women kind of outside. I think it's kind of quite these small things, that make a difference to them, where they feel like they're looking after themselves. I mean, I asked them how they looked after their hands because they didn't have any gloves, and they said, Pond's cold cream. So it was quite, minimalist by today's standard of what looking after yourself was like. But yeah,
well, that came up as well, because there were lots of comments earlier about the fact that the lack of gloves, the lack of knee pads, the lack of mouth protection when the sawmills and all the sawdust spilling everywhere, the sap you get off freshly cut timber that gets all sticky, and then so the risk of infection. Then of course the bugs and creepy crawlies and mosquitoes and all that kind of stuff, and poisonous plants and stinging nettles. By modern standards, they're not particularly well equipped for what they're doing, are they?
No, they really weren't. And I when I think about that, I think, oh, they really had things set against them, you know, because they had to deal with all these things. I mean, you know, when I asked them, I said, didn't you, like, kind of in awe, thinking, like, how did you do this job? And they were like, well, we just had to.
We just did, yeah.
We just did our bit for the war. That's what we did. And they're so completely modest about it, and just that was what we did. You know, very proud as well of what they did, but very modest. You know, yeah.
Comment from Judith there. We can be beautiful and tough broads at the same time. Ha ha. So thank you, Judith. Yeah, no, it's
natural beauty.
Natural beauty. Yeah, yeah.
So yeah, these are a couple of the newspaper clippings that I discovered from the beginning of the war, which I felt really kind of represented the prejudice that was against the women. So, you know, laughter for land army. It was a meeting where it was being reported that it was suggested that maybe women could work in forestry, or women could work in these jobs, and all the men were laughing about it, saying, you know, we can't fault the fact that they're so eager to offer their services, but unfortunately they're not up early enough in the morning because they stay up too late at night. And, you know, lots of kind of jokes about their morals, which certainly, you know, there was nothing like that about the men at all. But, you know, Forestry Handicap in Southwest, really, you know, they wthey were told that they were more ornamental than useful. Many timber merchants said they didn't want them, but the government said they had to have them. The women said they really didn't know what to do with us at the beginning. So, you know, when people doubt you so much, when you're in that job and you just want to do your bit for the war, like your brothers, it kind of kicks in something quite primal in you, I think, and they really wanted to prove themselves. So, you know, often they, you know, there's stories like people saying, why are you working in the middle of a snow blizzard felling trees? And they were like, because we want to prove we're tough enough to do this job. You know, so they had to literally work so hard to gain that credibility and, you know, and to be accepted as someone that was on an equal par as the men. So this lady is a legend. She's called Bella Nolan. She was a Scottish Women's Timber Corps lady, and she heard her foreman saying, I don't think much of these women, they can't do this job. So she walked up to him and she said, okay, well, how about I work the other end of a crosscut saw with you and we have a felling jaw. He happily accepted, and the next day they started work in the morning. They were working, pulling to and fro all morning, working into the afternoon, when Alan Stewart said to her, Bella, you know, you can stop whenever you like. You've done quite well. She was like, I'm fine, actually, thank you, I'll carry on. They carried on working, and again he encouraged her to stop, but she had already decided that no matter how tired she was, and she was utterly exhausted, she wouldn't stop. She wasn't going to stop until he decided to stop. And by the end of the day, they had felled 120 trees between them. Her record went up in the office, and she was never challenged again. Yeah. So it's just really shows kind of the fighting spirit of these girls.
And that is the universal for every time I've done one of these presentations, again, like the 6 AAA, it's that same thing. They didn't just have to equal in order to stop the people, the negative. They had to go beyond what people were expecting. So you have to come from a position, because you're coming from behind in the sexist, misogynist, and people just the negative people saying things about you. You have to overcompensate by being even better. So we have the same with the women auxiliary pilots, who had to go beyond what was expected. You could even say across the Tuskegee Airmen in the African American, they have to go to that next level to be accepted. You have to prove yourself beyond the normal standard. So that I'm completely not surprised that Women's Timber Corps has exactly the same as all these other units. They had to just work really hard.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, I think I mean, one of the things I absolutely loved about meeting these women was this sense of like, when I'd be speaking to them, I'd see this like almost like this kind of peace cross over their face and a little smile appear. And I'd think to myself, they're back there, they're back in the forest. You know, we're talking about these experiences in the forest, and you know, after about an hour and a half, there they were, and all their stories were flooding out, and it was just, honestly, it was so moving. And they had this incredible freedom. They had this a freedom from the rules of society about how women should behave. They were there wearing a pair of trousers for the first time in their life. They could sit with their legs apart astride a tree trunk, because that was just what they did in their jobs as lumberjills. They, you know, didn't have to be quiet and only speak when they were spoken to. They were shouting timber. They were driving haulage trucks, felling 10-ton trees, calculating the figures needed for wartime timber supplies. I mean, it was incredible, the transformation for these women. And they were so confident. They had developed this incredible confidence in their physique, in their strength, but also in their skills. I think of all the skills they're learning, for driving to loading, to kind of working with tools and doing the measuring. I mean, honestly, it was just incredible. And not only that, they absolutely loved being in nature. So nothing better than sitting around a campfire after a hard day's or morning's work with the fellow lumberjills, like the great camaraderie, the friendships they made. They became lifelong friends. They were more like sisters, and many stayed in touch for literally 80 years after the war. They had, you know, and it was just this incredible freedom. And I think when you, you know, whoever it is, if you take people out of the confines of like what's expected of you from your family or from your society, and you put them out in nature, people become who they're meant to be. People can shine in all sorts of ways. They're not being held back by stigma or prejudice about how they're meant to behave, you know. And I think this is what happened to the Lumberjills, and what made them such an incredible kind of workforce of women. They were so diverse. They came from all diverse backgrounds, and you know, yeah, just had like an amazing transformative time. In the summer, they would love to go and have a wash. It was very, very dirty work. They probably were quite smelly. And so having a wash in a stream or a river would have been very welcome. They said up in Scotland, they said it was more like the life of a cave woman at times, when they had to use a bucket and chuck it arrangement for the toilet. And, you know, yeah, it really was quite extraordinary. So this is a picture that I took after Molly told me about Lochawe, and she described it so beautifully. I just had to go and visit. And this picture I wanted to use to tell you one of her stories about how she got to a dance in the evening. So she would walk from her house 2 miles down the road to the manse to meet 7 of her friends who were there. All 8 of them would walk another 2 miles down to this slipway. There would be a rowing boat waiting for them, and all 8 of them would climb in. They would row half a mile across Lochawe to the other side to Kilcrennan, and then they would walk another mile up the hill to I can't remember the name of it now, but to the village hall that was up the hill. And from 9 o'clock in the evening till 2 in the morning, they would dance the night away with all the you know, GIs and the people that were there. And they would do the jitterbug and the foxtrot and the waltz, etc. And then after that, they had to get home again. So like at 2 in the morning, they'd set off on the reverse journey. And she said often they didn't get home until just before work on a Saturday morning, when they had to do a half day. And she said, I think I was pretty fit in those days.
Wow.
And she lived to 103. Yeah, so it didn't do her any harm, all that exercise back in the day.
Brilliant stuff.
Coming back down to Sussex now, here's Eileen, the lady on the right. So she was on the urgent mission to produce pit props and load them up on the side of the road to be collected the next day. Well, when she walked past later on that evening, she noticed that they had all been taken away. She knew that it wasn't the Lumberjills. They weren't meant to be collected yet. And so she set off down the road to look for them because she thought somebody's gone and pinched my pit props. Well, she came across an anti-aircraft camp and she noticed over the fence that in the camp there was a roaring fire going, the top of a fire. So she said she was quite headstrong in those days and rather furious. She walked in there, marched up to them and said, "Where did you get that wood from for that fire?" They all looked a bit shifty and said they didn't know. So in the end, she said, "Well, I want to speak to someone who's in charge." And she was sent to see the sergeant. The sergeant looked into it and unfortunately he found out that they were her pit props. And she was quite annoyed, as you can imagine. So he offered her a cup of tea and a piece of cake by way of making peace with her, introduced himself to her as Wally. And Wally later became her husband, to whom she was married for 54 years. And that's them on their wedding day there.
Fantastic.
So during the war, we produce a lot of timber from Britain's forests. We produce 60% of our timber needs from homegrown timber. It was 18 million tons of timber. Half that went down the coal mines. We went from 14,000 men working in forestry to over 80,000 people. Many of those were prisoners of war, but 1 in 5 of those, about 15 to 18,000, were women working up and down the country. And during World War II, we produced more wood from British forests than ever before in history. So I think those Lumberjills did a very good job. One thing I must say is those measurers I told you about at the beginning, they were promoted because they were in charge of the money. So they had a bit of power. Often they were promoted to supervisors, foremen, put in charge of whole forestry operations, and even some of them were put in charge of large groups of men. One such lady called Doris, she was in charge of a whole group of lumberjills, sawmills, forestry, camps, etc., and 30 men. And she said, "My goodness, the men do not like being given orders by a woman." They were really quite incredible, though. So these are some more of the women I met. Joan, top left, she was the lady that had the War Office stamp on her bottom. Molly, top right, she was the lady who went to the dance in the evening and rode across the loch. Bottom left, that's Pat, and her best friend married a German prisoner of war. And Mary, bottom right, she was the one that lost her thumb in a sawmill. So all of these women, when I met them, they all said to me how upset they were at the end of the war because they didn't receive any recognition. They weren't allowed to keep their jobs. They were encouraged back into domestic service. Even if there was work for them to do, sometimes it was offered to prisoners of war instead. They were not allowed to keep their uniforms or take part in Remembrance Day parades. And over the years, it really upset them, understandably. So this is Margaret here with me on the sofa. She was invited onto the Great British Menu banquet. Her story was used as inspiration for one of the meals, and we had a really lovely time. So she was the lady that brought the phone lines down. And then Eileen, top right, she was the lady that married Wally, who had her pit props stolen. And then Audrey, Irene, she is the bottom right. When I went to see her, she was living in Devon, and she opened the door to me and she said, "Oh my goodness, nobody's ever asked me what I did in the war before." And I really thought, how forgotten are these women? That's incredible. So after I had this lovely conversation with her, I said, "Oh, what did it do for you being a Lumberjill?" And she said, it gave me incredible freedom, and I realized I could do anything I wanted to do, which was a sentiment that many of the Lumberjills had. So now there are, so better late than never. Gordon Brown gave them a badge in 2008. Unfortunately, it was a wheat sheaf badge, which didn't represent the pine tree or the crossed axes. So there was a little disappointment about that, but they did say it was better late than never to get some recognition. Yep. There's now also 3 monuments to the Lumberjills. This one is at Dalby Forest in the North York Moors, and there's another one at the Queen Elizabeth Forest Park in Aberfoyle, and a third one in the National Arboretum Memorial in Staffordshire. So they have had some recognition.
Belated recognition, yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So my name is Joanna Foat. I do have a website, www.thelumberjills.uk, and also I have, you can follow me on social media. And I have 3 books, a 4th on the way. So the blue book on the left is my history book, which is all the wonderful stories about the women that I met, what they ate, where they lived, etc. The book on the right is my first novel in a series, and I've nearly finished the second novel in the series. And then this one is my photo book, which is a collection of about 180 amazing photographs, some of them which you've seen here today, but really it's almost like a photo essay of all the different things they did in the forest. It's extraordinary. I never ever thought I would get that many photographs. So yeah, they're all available.
I mean, you've shown us some amazing photos today. I mean, you know, just extraordinary. And just and the fact that they're actually showing the grittiness of the job. Some of them are a little bit kind of more, not posed, but yeah, sort of set up a bit. But as I said earlier, they're not hiding the work effort. It's a real insight into the work they did.
Absolutely.
Well, we've got lots of questions for you because I knew there would be. Philip Blood, fascinating, truly enjoyed the talk. So I'll just give you a bit of praise first. Tamsin, this has been great. Thank you so much, Joanna. Rob, thank you, Joanna, for bringing their contribution to wider awareness. Veronica, getting job done, spirit. But we have some questions leading off the fact that they weren't recognized at the end of the war. So Norma said, and I would not expect anything else from Norma than to be blazingly feminist there. Then the war ended and society tried to stuff them back into the box of gender roles. And Veronica at the beginning said something about how did that influence their life. I mean, you've partially answered these questions, but the difference is, unlike some of the male units that have a unit tie and they have reunions or they can continue in the service, so many people in the RAF continued in the RAF and the Army. This lot, they didn't even get to keep their uniforms. So I suppose in talking to them, there was something of a bittersweet recollection. They enjoyed the actual war bit in the sense they had that camaraderie, but afterwards it must have come to a pretty sudden and brutal and disappointing end.
Yeah, absolutely, it did. And that, I think that stayed with them for, well, it was 60 years. It was like 60 years before they got proper recognition, and that's like a whole lifetime. It's too late for many of them. And yeah, I think that it was why I wanted to tell their story, because I could feel their pain. I could feel their upset. And I just thought, I really want to give these women a voice. One lady, she said to me, oh, I tried to kick up a stink in the local paper and I was just laughed at. And, people told me, oh, stop going on about it, because obviously all the attention was on the front line and men fighting and, which is really important. But it doesn't diminish what these women have done and many women during wartime. And so it really changed them. I mean, a lot of the women that I met, they said they went on to become youth workers or work in teaching or in colleges. One lady said to me she really felt like she'd been given an amazing opportunity in her life and she wanted to give that same opportunity to other young people. So she went into doing youth work. and other Lumberjills, they continued to be utterly awesome, kind of practical, kind of DIY kind of physical women, like, you know, sawing down trees in their back gardens. And, you know, some of them actually married farmers because their tractor driving skills were quite useful. They would carry on working in the farms. And, but also they were kind of quite mighty, kind of, one lady, she told me about how she dug a trench for a new water mains to be like connected up with her house, and, you know, did it all on her own. And she even told me a story about standing on some step ladder trying to paint the top of the hallway in her high heels, because that was the only way that she could reach the top. But they were really kind of quite like just brilliant women. I mean, so inspiring. Very good sense of humor, very funny, you know. And they traveled a lot as well. I think all that itinerant work, they made them just want to see other places and travel. It gave them that courage and confidence, and that has continued down the generations. So like I'm still in contact with many Lumberjills families, and their daughters and their granddaughters have either been inspired to join the army or been inspired to go and travel the world, you know, after they've retired. So it's really kind of their legacy is quite incredible.
Well, another representative comment from JD, and JD, I shouted out to you in the sidebar. It was your video when you went to the memorial that caused me to reach out to Joanna. So I'm glad I did, JD. As I'll read his comment, they really appreciate Joanna's work at bringing these stories to surface. I've been wanting to learn more about the Women's Timber Corps. This has been one of my favorite episodes. Given that we've done 1,700 of these, that's pretty good praise. But we have a couple of questions about things that you were talking about earlier that I would like to address beyond sort of the sort of general ones. So I'll find those ones, then we'll bring this in. So where have we got there? Yeah, from Sean. Joanna mentioned they moved from forest to forest. What accommodations did they live in as they moved across the country? I mean, was it tents within the forest? Were they put up in local, you know, church halls? How did it work?
So if they were the lucky ones, they would be in a Nissan, you know, in a training camp, in a Nissan hut, or a kind of a properly kind of designed, made camp for the Women's Land Army and Timber Corps. However, the vast majority were not, because they were moving from forest to forest. So they were often led to, they basically had to go door knocking. They were meant to have welfare, ladies that worked in welfare from the Women's Land Army that were finding them accommodation, but this proved to be very difficult. There was a lot of prejudice against the women in terms of people not wanting to have them stay in the houses, because who were these women, you know, with, you know, big muscly women with wearing boots and trousers. They also couldn't pay as much as the men for their digs, and so they were rejected because the men were given favour for staying there. And if they were allowed to stay in these houses, they then had to help with the housework as well after a full day's work in the forest.
Of course, so, yes, yeah. I don't even out in the forest, but get the apple pie on, dear. Yeah,
exactly. So yeah, and it varied a lot. So up in Scotland, they'd be in a bothy somewhere and literally, you know, washing in the nearby stream, and yeah, very, very basic, I would say. Yeah, lots of.
Sorry, yeah, thank you for that. You mentioned the fact that they have to hand their uniforms. There's no pensions. There's none of that infrastructure there. But the injuries came up. There were a few people who've had some experience of forestry. So Roderick said heavy lifting on a daily basis breaks the human body down. Were there a lot of work-related injuries? You know, crushing injuries, strains, rotator cuffs, back injuries. Samuel said injuries of the lower leg, hands, back. I moved all the heavy logs in my 20s, and those were typical injuries. And the issue is, of course, it's not just during your service. It's that could then affect you for the rest of your life. You know, if you've come from a particular job and your back has been fucked in World War II, and now you want to go back and earn again. I mean, as you said, they're being encouraged to go back and marry and have babies. But you mentioned the dangers right at the beginning of this. But do you have any kind of statistics about how many of these women, perhaps 20, 30 years down the line, found they had got problems with, you know, arthritis, rheumatoid, you know, hernias?
Yeah. So there was a lot of women actually did say to me that they had rheumatism, which I think that's quite a kind of a general term now. It's probably more kind of used in the past, but yeah, there was some research done on like 134 women, and looking at all sorts of accidents and injuries and kind of like digestive problems and everything, menstrual issues. In fact, I think the survey was done because it was thought that it would affect women's baby making ability or something. And they discovered that there was nothing to do with menstruation. It didn't have any effect on that at all, but it did have an effect on their shoulders and their muscles and their backache and all these other things. But in this study, they had an average of, I think it's like 20 days sickness absence a year. So that's like effectively like a whole month. Or was it 30? Anyway, it worked out in my mind, it's like a whole month off in sickness absence through various things through.
Which, given that they're motivated, given that they're wanting to do this, that they're going to, if they're taking work off, it's because it is actually stopping them working. This, I can't imagine this. Oh no, I've got a bit of a cold. This is going to be, I have seriously buggered my back last week. I need to lie down on a hard block for a week before I can work again, which again just shows their determination. That because anything like that, back injuries, shoulder, they don't tend to go away in 2 days and a couple of anodins. They're things that end up creating long-term disabilities. So yeah, it's a real reminder how tough this job is. So a couple of last questions. Ian asked, we talked about like the Bevan boys eventually getting to march in London. Did the Lumberjills ever get to march at the Cenotaph?
Yeah, along with the Women's Land Army, the first time they marched to the Cenotaph was in 2000 when they had their own special ceremony, and that continued until 2012, I believe. I was actually honoured to be able to march with them in 2012 to the Cenotaph, and they laid a wreath for the Women's Timber Corps as well as the Women's Land Army, and it was really, really special and amazing for those women to be involved.
Absolutely.
And
the last question, I'm going to leave it to Veronica because I think it's important to have a woman have the final word in a show like today. And we've talked a lot on this channel about veterans reunions and camaraderie and the Band of Brothers idea. And Veronica's asking about, were the relationships between women different from between men? She says she's found similar pattern among nurses, but less among servicemen. I mean, as we said, they've had this. They've had their uniforms taken away. They've had their identity. The government didn't treat them very well at the end of the war. So less of a kind of reunion get together. But do you think the relationships that they had were different to those between men?
I don't know. You've stumped me on the last question. You mean as in the men that were away fighting?
Just how they related, the camaraderie in that sense. How was it? Was there some, common denominator among these women about how they cared for each other, looked after each other? Because they're having to fight the war effort, the physicality, and a certain amount of prejudice.
I mean, the only thing that I just all the time it just thinks if such adversity they were facing on all fronts, not only not enough food to eat, nowhere to live, not enough money to live on, really hard work, prejudice against them. I think that just made them so bond so strongly together. They were all they had. And I think there was an incredible understanding that they had all done something amazing. And it was kind of, they all said it was one of the best times of their lives. So that kind of, says a lot, doesn't it? And the fact that they stayed friends for life and, they became aunties to each other's, children and stayed in touch throughout their lives. So, I don't know how it would have differed from the men. I think it's probably not too different to,
I mean, it feels like, when you said, it's about 18,000 of them, and I was thinking, well, that's like a large infantry division. And I was thinking about how many infantry divisions the British, for example, fielded in World War II. And then when you gave the statistics of how much lumber and timber they produced, I'm thinking, man for man or woman for woman, if you're talking about a unit that punched above their weight, then they absolutely did. I mean, and of course we're talking about the POWs and as well doing the work, but to solve that problem of timber which they pretty much did. This initiative went, as you said there, from 96% imports to eventually producing over half what they needed in a wartime environment when you need even more wood than usual. I think that's the proof of the pudding, that this wasn't some sort of cursory, well, we're just letting the women, it's like Spitfires for frying pans for Spitfires, right? Which we all now know was a just complete nonsense bit of fluff to unite people. You can't make Spitfires out of frying pans. It was and carrots being good for the eyesight. We've kind of done that one on the channel, that they're bringing people together, events that don't actually necessarily have a concrete result. This is a bringing people together, but actually fundamentally providing a result for a gap in the war effort.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we will leave things there. So, folks, you know what to do. Go and buy the books. Go and check out Joanna's website. Look at the link we put there to a Pathé film that you can watch about the timber corps in World War II, and basically go out there and spread the word, because I think these women need a little bit more of a recognition. I mean, Joanna is single-handedly, well, I'm sure you've got lots of friends and colleagues who are helping, but you are banging the drum for them, and hopefully in our little way we can help as well. So, folks, that's been fantastic. 2 more shows this week. It's Liberty Ships tomorrow and Merchant Marine on Wednesday. Click like and subscribe. Consider becoming a channel member or a Patreon. Visit my guests' websites, buy their books, read their blogs, go to their talks, etc., so they write more of them. That's how it works. So there we are. This is Paul Woodard for World War II TV saying enjoy the rest of your Monday. Thank you, viewers, and thank you, Joanna. Brilliant.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.